Please subscribe and don't forget to press the bell icon to get notified whenever we upload a new video.
Hello and welcome. If there's one issue that's becoming more and more important these days, it's privacy. Rahul Mattan, who you may have seen here before on Virtuosity as an expert on privacy law, has now done what's the definitive book on the subject. In India, the issue of privacy has become inextricably linked, of course, with Aadhaar. Nandan Nilekani, the creator of Aadhaar, defended the scheme here on Virtuosity over a year and a half ago. Since then, Nandan has refused to say very much on the subject. So I went to Bangalore 2 days ago to coax Nandan to break his silence. So Rahul, Nandan and I sat down, we discussed privacy, and of course, we discussed Aadhaar. You say at the beginning of your book that this book is not about Aadhaar, but it would never have happened if it was not for Aadhaar. So explain that.
I mean, I've been a privacy lawyer for 20 years,
Yeah.
and I've been thinking about these issues for a really long time. But and I also say in the book, 2016 is the year that Aadhaar exploded, and
Yep.
it was really in 2016 that I started considering, how privacy got to where it was. And in the context of that, I did a lot of research on the history of privacy and how we got to where we are. And I started thinking about things like consent and whether it's meaningful and necessary and things like that. And in the process, I realized that there's got to be a better way to do it. And Aadhaar has forced us to reconsider a lot of the strongly held notions about privacy. They've been held for over half a decade. And I think that's really how I started thinking about the accountability framework that I then go on to explain in some detail in the book.
There's a story in the book about how Nandan Nilekani, who you knew vaguely socially, was on a flight going to Delhi, a morning flight, and you arrived and you met him. And you sat down, you told him that while you understood that Aadhaar was a good idea, you were concerned about the privacy implications. That's correct?
Absolutely.
You remember that?
Yeah, we used to fly to Delhi together because we both lived in Bangalore and had work in Delhi.
Yeah.
So we were on this thing. So I think he definitely, the conversation with Rahul sensitized me to the privacy issue. And I had a colleague called Deepika Moghal-Shetty, also from the National Law School. And so in 2010, I wrote to the Prime Minister saying that even as we roll out Aadhaar, we need to parallelly plan a data privacy law. So that was...
That's as far back as 2010?
Yeah, that's 8 years back.
And did the Prime Minister reply?
Well, I mean, I think I probably also mentioned it, when I met him. And it was there, but it was just one of the things that was there.
So now, I remember interviewing you in this room, and we mentioned Aadhaar. But at that stage, you were still the hero of Aadhaar, the guy who'd come in from the private sector, had gone into government and introduced one of the most successful schemes of its kind anywhere in the world. And then in 2016, the mood changes, as he says. Did that take you by surprise?
Yeah, I think what happened in 2016-17 was, as you said, the simultaneous extension of Aadhaar to multiple things.
Yeah.
To bank accounts, to the PAN card, and to the mobile phone. And I think the insistent messages people got about connect your bank account, I think that did have an impact on the public.
So was it surprising to become a bad guy suddenly after being lionized for being a titan of Indian industry?
No, actually,
the man who took made it famous?
I went from a good guy to a bad guy, and then went back to being a good guy.
When?
In the last few months.
You're a good guy now?
Yeah, I'm a good guy. Because I think people have realized that while they were obsessed with this Aadhaar stuff, the reality was there are lots of other things happening in the world which were far more pernicious. And therefore, I think people have realized that maybe they got distracted and the real challenge was elsewhere.
Okay, that same interview which I referred to when I talked about privacy in Aadhaar, and we touched on it much less than perhaps we would now, you said to me, people have no idea of what foreign companies are doing, how they're reading their data, extracting information from social media. This was before anybody, certainly before I had ever heard of Cambridge Analytica, etc. Did you have a suspicion that something like this was going on?
No, it was fairly obvious even in those days that the amount of data being collected was enormous. And that data was being processed in many, many ways to do advertisements and so on. Of course, I didn't know specifically about
Facebook
Cambridge and all that, but it was very clear that the real challenge was there. And in the Aadhaar design, Aadhaar was designed not to collect data. So to me, the first test is is this system designed to collect data or not? Whereas all these other platforms are all designed to collect data by the, from every source. So I certainly had my misgivings that at some point this would become a bigger issue.
But Aadhaar, you say, was not designed to collect data, but you are collecting information, biometric information, addresses, stuff like that?
No, it is the very basic information required to give somebody a foundational ID. Basic information is name, address, date of birth, sex, and email ID and phone number is optional. So as much of the data you have in a passport or in a driver's license or in a voter ID card. And the biometrics. And the biometrics was there for one very, very important reason.
Which is?
How do you give 1 billion Indians a unique ID? How do you make sure they have only one ID? And there was no other way we could do it without biometrics, because at that time, many Indians didn't have any ID at all. And if you had just relied on them saying so, then many people could take multiple IDs and game the system. So we had to have a relatively foolproof way of ensuring uniqueness.
And
so
that's
the
the only
biometrics was the
information.
only purpose, yes.
Okay. Now, I want to come back to Rahul and the privacy debate, but the criticism of Aadhaar is that if somebody hacks into your database, and contrary to what Ravi Shankar Prasad says, I imagine it is possible, they could get information on my financial details, on my income tax details, on every possible thing about me. Your contention, the 2 interviews we've done on the subject, is that that's not true. All they would get is the information that's in the base, which is name, address, biometrics. You still stick to that?
Yes, no, the design is such. I mean, we designed it at the time to be privacy by design, where this was a dumb system which only did ID verification. And the actual user of the system stored the data in their respective system. So the health system had healthcare records, the banking system has banking records, the income tax system has PAN data. So deliberately we called it as a federated database, because we didn't want all the data to be in one location. So that was part of the design 10 years back.
But don't the systems talk to each other? Isn't there a way in
No,
which...
they talk only one way, in the sense the banking system uses Aadhaar to verify an ID. It makes a request and the request is satisfied. So the Aadhaar system only knows that a request came. Aadhaar system does not know what was the request for. That's what we call as optimal ignorance. Make sure that each party remains only to the job they have.
So what was your concern then? You said you had privacy concerns when you first met Nandan. What were they?
So I think the way I articulated to Nandan was that if Aadhaar is a unique identity, we don't have a unique identity today.
Yeah.
And then that unique identity will become ubiquitous. Once it becomes ubiquitous, while the central database is hard to get into, there will be one common thread through all the databases. Now, as we've said on previous occasions on your show, it's actually very difficult to go to each database and pick up that common thread between all of them. But once you have a common thread, it will become possible. You need to have a law which lays out the framework that says what can be done and what can't be done, particularly with regard to the types of data you can collect, how long you can keep the data, what you use the data for. If you don't have those sorts of guardrails, it is possible to do anything.
So what are you saying? You're saying that if somebody wanted to hack my bank account or say my passport details or whatever, it may have been difficult at one stage, but once you have one ID, it becomes easier?
No. What I mean is that if they happen to get into one database,
okay,
and they find all your information in that database.
Say they get into my bank account.
Let's say they get into your bank account. They've
Okay.
got all your information in the bank account. They don't have the information in the very next bank account, the account you have with another bank.
Yeah.
But if they know your Aadhaar number, and your Aadhaar number is linked to both those bank accounts, they can then correlate that the same person exists in both banks.
Okay.
And in this manner, they can, database by database, put together a profile of you across all these various verticals.
Okay. Is that a danger?
No, I think that was an issue. And in 2011, we had come up with the idea of tokenization, which meant that the Aadhaar number is used, but when you store it in a database, you actually hash it, or you know.
What is hash?
Encrypt it.
In English, what is hash?
You encrypt it.
Okay.
You scramble it and you store it there. But that was too advanced an idea in those days. But now people have accepted the idea. So the UIDA has announced something called tokenization. So unless allowed by law, databases cannot store the Aadhaar number.
They can't.
Unless allowed by law.
What is
so
that
for
mean?
example,
What is allowed by law?
For example, the PAN card linked to Aadhaar is allowed by law, upheld by the Supreme Court. So there they can store the Aadhaar number. The bank account is supported under the PMLA, so they are storing it on that basis. But a private party, for example, cannot store the Aadhaar number. So to a large extent, this has also been handled by ensuring that the Aadhaar number is not everywhere and only where allowed by law.
You said, and all the justifications of Aadhaar were in terms of leakages in the system, corruption, of a way of delivering benefits to the poorest of the poor. In your original scheme of things, was Aadhaar ever meant to be this mandatory thing that people always needed?
No, as I said, the Aadhaar itself was voluntary, but we had always said that if a particular project requires the entire universe of people in that to have Aadhaar as mandatory, that's their decision. I still think that the original intent has been a spectacular success.
I don't think
no,
anybody
but that's
disputes
important.
that. Nobody
So-
disputes that.
No, people dispute that too, but
Yeah, really?
Of
No. There you're still a good guy. The idea is that having created this way of delivering welfare benefits, you then sat back and watched as it was taken over to set up a surveillance state.
I think this surveillance state is certainly not anywhere close to what Aadhaar does, because Aadhaar by definition does not collect data. The first requirement of a surveillance state is you collect data. Second, Aadhaar is used for authentication only a few times a year when you open a bank account.
We know
No, the
that.
point is that
Yeah, we know that.
surveillance,
But
it is
once
not-
they have your Aadhaar number, and Aadhaar is mandatory for everything, they can find out where your mobile phone is going, they can find out where you're staying, they can check your credit cards, they can check your bank accounts, they can check your insurance, they can pretty much keep tabs on you. No?
No, I think this is a highly overinflated fear. And frankly, if you want to do surveillance, just use your mobile phone.
Explain that.
See, everybody carries a mobile phone.
Yeah.
A billion mobile phones are there. Every mobile phone is on 24/7. Every mobile phone's location known in real time. Every mobile phone's calls can be recorded.
Yeah.
Every mobile phone's messages can be recorded. So a true surveillance state would actually use that to do surveillance. Or what's happening in places like China, where they have ubiquitous face cameras which are capturing pictures of you at a traffic light and using sophisticated face recognition to identify you within 30 minutes.
You agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, the way I put
Disagree
it
with
is
them on something, yeah?
no. Well, the way I put it is that this, if you were using this for surveillance,
Yeah.
it is a highly inefficient way to do surveillance.
Why?
Because once again, the mobile phone is obviously always on 24/7.
Yeah.
Aadhaar, you could, and here's where maybe I'll slightly disagree with him. In the future,
Finally.
well, in the future,
Yeah.
if we don't have a privacy law, it is possible for the government to mandate that you use Aadhaar for virtually everything that you do. Once the volume of use of Aadhaar becomes, 12, 24 times a day, 100 times a day, at that volume, it is possible to build a trail. If it is possible for some individual to sit on top of the pyramid and get the data from all these various 100 sources. At present, there isn't such an architecture. But if there is some God switch that can be turned on, that someone can observe all the actions across the banks, the mobile companies, when you board an aircraft, whatever else you use
But
it
it's
for.
not inconceivable that this God switch can be created.
I think it's absolutely, it's not. And I think that's the reason why we need a law. My concern when I first spoke to Nandan was primarily around this, the unification of databases. My concern today is that we are at that big data inflection point in India, where it's not just the 4 or 5 data points that Aadhaar collects, or the 8 or 10 data points that a mobile company collects. It's the metadata that people have about you. It's also how multiple databases can be overlaid on top of each other and build profiles of you. That needs some serious regulation.
You have no problem with that?
No, I've been saying for the last 8 years that we need a privacy law. And I'm the biggest supporter of the fundamental right to privacy judgment.
It's a little odd that when you introduced Aadhaar, which you thought was going to be a great welfare measure, which would help people deliver things to the poor, what you ended up doing was unleashing a privacy debate which we had ignored in India for so long. And for the first time, you've had a government saying there is no right to privacy, a court saying, no, you're wrong, there is a right to privacy. So contrary to what anybody expected then, Aadhaar has become about privacy and has had some positive impact.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, I think the best thing that happened was, as I said, the judgment for the fundamental right to privacy, the fact that Aadhaar has an Aadhaar law, and the upcoming data privacy law based on the Justice Sri Krishna Committee report. And in fact, I believe the impact of the privacy judgment is way beyond Aadhaar. It'll do with Section 377 issues. It'll deal with whether you can have prohibition or not. It'll deal with whether you can eat beef or not. In fact, I think the implications of this are far beyond Aadhaar. Aadhaar was the reason for this.
Was the trigger.
But I think the trigger actually has led to a very good set of positive outcomes.
If the Supreme Court, the judgment expected in the next 2 months or so, if it says that Aadhaar should not be mandatory, would you be happy with that?
Yeah, I'm perfectly fine with that.
Really?
Yeah. In fact,
that's not the government's position, though. So your position is different from the government's position.
My view is that the real use of Aadhaar is beyond all this. The real use of Aadhaar is when it is used for delivering online benefits and a lot of other things, innovation on top of this. So if it is not mandatory for something, I'm fine with it.
So are there solutions? Are there ways of protecting our privacy? That's after the break. Don't go away. Welcome back. As you probably know, Nandan Nilekani has been remarkably silent about Aadhaar despite the many attacks on this scheme. But in this discussion with Rahul Mattan and myself, he finally breaks the silence. We've been following the Cambridge Analytica thing, and that's not actually an Aadhaar type scandal, but it's a privacy type scandal. Do you think that kind of scandal impacts Aadhaar in the way we look at it?
No, in fact, I think what it shows us is that the whole issue of people have been obsessed with personally identifiable information, PII data, your name, your number and all that. But what the Cambridge Analytica case has shown is I don't need any of that. By seeing his likes and dislikes on social media, I can predict his personality and how to influence that personality either to sell him something or to influence his voting. And that's the most devastating part of this, that you have now a way to do that. And that's the real insidious part of all these things.
How can we guard against it?
I mean, one is not to use all these products. I mean, that's one way of doing it. But
that's like telling people to get off Facebook, which is not really going to happen, right?
I'm not on Facebook.
I'm not on Facebook either.
See?
But I'm sure Rahul is.
Barely.
Yeah, yeah, but there are people.
Yeah, so I think that's where I think that's a big issue, and nobody has the answers to that. I mean, the whole discussion about the meddling in US elections by foreign forces and all that is all people are grappling with. What do we do with the situation where it's so easy for outside forces to influence the minds of people because the social media persona is helping us to target them much better. So it's an open issue.
You accept that? You think that while we are still debating Aadhaar, in many ways the debate has moved ahead of us. There are other concerns which are not sufficiently addressing?
Yeah, and look, I think I'll frame it slightly differently from the way Nandan has. All privacy laws around the world are focused on personally identifiable information. And they say that you need consent before you collect personally identifiable information. Today you can collect non-personal information, layer it on top of all sorts of other non-personal information and build a profile that is deeply personal. So
but consent is also a bit of a joke, no? Does anybody ever read when you download an app or you do something? Do you ever read the site uses cookies? You always say, oh, we don't mind, you go on. Right?
I mean, it's consent fatigue, and I speak about this in the book, is that we just get so many things to agree to that we just sign up, assuming that it'll be okay. But even if we did read it, it would not apply to non-personal information. And today, non-personal information is capable of being collected ambiently. As you saw over the Cambridge Analytica case, a lot of election advertising was targeted very, very finely and very narrowly at types of people. That is extremely dangerous, and current law has no way to protect against that because current law only deals with personally identifiable information.
So what do you think?
Certainly we need to have consent from an autonomy perspective because after all it is my data and I can't just be signed up to a service without consenting. But just because I've consented when I signed up to allow the person to do A, B, and C, not knowing what A, B, and C fully means, that should not be held against me. And the data collector should still be accountable for what harm happens to me.
So they can't take the line. But there was this whole Airtel thing where they took Aadhaar numbers and used them for a second purpose. But they said people had consented, and people had consented because we consent to everything that people send us. You're saying even then they should be held accountable.
Exactly.
Yeah. You're okay with that?
No, I think that is Rahul's great insight in the book, that we are entering a world where there's a data tsunami,
Yeah.
that every device we touch, every Fitbit we wear, every car we drive is generating data. And if you're going to go around giving consent each and every time, he calls it consent fatigue.
Yeah.
And therefore, once we had consent fatigue, we give consent without worrying. And therefore, consent as a means of enforcing privacy is broken. And I think he's making a very valid point that you have to put the onus on the entity collecting data, because they have all the data, they know how to use it, and make them accountable. I think that's an absolutely very, very good suggestion.
So for the Cambridge Analytica thing, you would hold Facebook responsible?
I think there is no doubt that if data was shared,
Yeah.
and if that data was shared was used for the wrong purposes, then the organization sharing the data is accountable for it.
Okay. I think that has to be logically said. On Aadhaar, I'll just give you 2-3 of the criticisms. You've debunked the surveillance state criticism. The other criticism is that you're exclusionary, that there are children who go to ration shops and die because nobody will give them food because they don't have Aadhaar data. Does that kind of thing worry you?
Well, I think we have to make sure that Aadhaar does not become a basis for exclusion.
Okay.
And that
How
is
do you
not-
do that?
That is not so much an Aadhaar issue as the design of the PDS system, which provides ration, which says that it should have an override where if, for example, the authentication does not work or whatever, then the person providing the ration has the override if it's a genuine case. So that's more a design of the system outside of Aadhaar. So absolutely, in fact, the Aadhaar law is very clear that you
In
cannot
what
deny
way?
that you cannot deny somebody.
A benefit.
Yeah, if it's entitled.
So why does it happen?
No, it happens. Again, to the extent which it happens, we have to, that's a whole debatable thing. And
But one dead child is still a dead child, no? So
again,
the
I
extent
don't want to
is-
get into a
all right,
debate with
okay,
you
all
on
right,
this.
okay, but it's still pretty bad.
But I think, we obviously have to make sure it doesn't happen. I agree with that.
Yeah. And the way to do it would be what? That people, even if Aadhaar is supposedly mandatory, people should be able to use their discretion
Yeah, at the point of the
at the point of delivery where it happens.
Yeah.
Okay. The other criticism, apart from the surveillance state and the exclusion criticism, is that you've made it easier for people to target minorities.
No, again, this goes back. This is a variation of your surveillance argument.
Yeah, but
No, I don't think so.
currently
Because the
topical argument.
Because the database of Aadhaar is not open for anybody else by law. I mean, there have been many attempts to get data out of the UIDAI system, but the law says that data cannot be given out.
What about all these attempts to hack into it? I mean, every day is a news story of data being hacked, data being stolen, data being shared. Doesn't that worry you?
No, I think, again, the core system has been absolutely hack-free. On the edge, what happens
For
is,
like art students like me, define core system.
the actual Aadhaar system is, quite protected. What happens is, when the Aadhaar number was, for example, used in a government scheme,
Yeah,
and the government scheme published the details of that under the RTI,
right,
which requires them to say who got what. They have also published the Aadhaar number.
right.
So that's more a inadvertent display of the Aadhaar number, which is illegal under the Aadhaar Act. So a lot of the so-called breaches are of that nature.
Okay, so that brings me to what I was actually going to ask you, which is that Nandan Nilekani, technological genius, wizard, designs this perfect system, but ultimately it's implemented by Indian governments and Indian bureaucrats, neither of whom has any reputation for efficiency and a great reputation for ineptitude. So is it fair to trust them?
No, I think they can be trusted. And
Why?
if you look,
Why?
no, because again, you see, we cannot practice anecdotal economics. We have to look at data, right? We look at evidence. And for example, the recent State of the Aadhaar report, which looked across the country, or the research done by Center for Development in the US, which have again actually collected data on the ground, shows significant improvement in the delivery of benefits, significant value for people. So that is the basis for making these judgments.
The odd dead child, odd stolen data is okay.
No, I think finally, in any system, we have to minimize anything which is not the right thing to do, and then see whether overall it provides benefits. On that, the answer is an unequivocal yes. And I'm confident the Supreme Court will say that too.
This debate will run and run, and Virtuosity will be there to cover it. We'll see you again next week. Till then, goodbye and take care.